On this episode of Assignment Discovery, go behind the scenes as the president is faced with sending troops into battle in Commander-in-Chief, George H. Bush. As cameras roll, watch as Desert Shield becomes Desert Storm. Finally, see how President Bush confronts a dictator and lays to rest the ghosts of America's past. And for lesson plans on war and peace, go online to discoveryschool.com.
The following program is part of Cable in the Classroom, a free service of the cable communications industry and your local cable company.
Consider this before viewing Commander-in-Chief, George H. Bush, Part 1. Discuss what you know about the Vietnam War and its effect on American attitudes about war. As you watch, consider how U.S. leaders dealt with the ghosts of Vietnam when preparing for war in the Persian Gulf. Think about what George Bush, as the Commander-in-Chief, learned from the past to secure the future. Assignment Discovery now presents Commander-in-Chief, George H. Bush, Part 1.
He set the standard for a new world order, facing down a desert dictator.
Weapons of mass destruction had a real appeal to Saddam Hussein.
We're dealing with Hitler revisited.
And the ghosts of America's past.
We had to deal with the Vietnam syndrome in this war. You're darn right we
Allied
did.
Air Forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait.
Next, George Bush, Commander-in-Chief.
The role of Commander-in-Chief
He's the only one that can make the decision to send American forces into battle.
could mean the lives of young men and women wearing uniforms.
That, I think, is the most awesome decision any president has to make.
A light rain falls beneath a faint desert moon. The largest army ever assembled is at the ready in the Persian Gulf. Half a world away, the President of the United States prepares to carry out the awesome responsibility that comes with the job.
The most severe stress that you can imagine. This is the man who gives the order to send people to their deaths.
The Commander-in-Chief, one man who holds the fate of millions in his hands. A desert tyrant has overrun a tiny nation in the Persian Gulf. Now, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers are poised to launch a massive ground campaign to take it back.
I'm plagued by the image of body bags. It gets into my heart. Each kid is precious. Each soldier, each Marine, each person who gives his life is precious. But I've got to put forward. George Bush, journal entry, February 20th.
5 weeks of Allied airstrikes had pounded the Iraqi war machine. Led by F-117 stealth bombers, more than 80,000 sorties had been flown, dropping more than 60,000 tons of bombs on Iraqi air defense systems, supply lines, bridges, and eventually anything that moved.
The air campaign had a devastating effect on Iraq. So we were winning everywhere at that stage.
Bombing strikes keep U.S. casualties at a minimum, but they can't complete the mission. The commander-in-chief has to send Americans into a ground war to drive Saddam Hussein and 500,000 Iraqis out of Kuwait.
The ground war we worried about because this involved literally, obviously, going into positions that the Iraqis had had months to prepare. We had a fairly good plan, we thought. We had forces poised, ready to go, but we just didn't know.
It is a show of overwhelming force. While the air campaign is the first conflict televised live, the ground war is one of the most censored combat zones in history.
It's a whole different situation with press coverage here now.
Okay, 5 minutes of unimportant questions, all right? Nothing too tough.
All right, how are the booths?
Frankly, I think the pools are too large. I don't think the pools serve the military very well, nor do they serve the people at home back home.
You want to know whether or not there's going to be, what the date of the ground offensive is, right? And you want me to tell you that. And I'm not going to tell you that.
There, please.
That's the decision of the President of the United States.
The night bombing raids look like something out of a video game. The consequences, the bodies, are never shown. Overwhelming force and controlled coverage. 2 lessons learned the hard way.
The ghost of Vietnam was always lurking a bit out there. People like Colin Powell, myself, and others had served in Vietnam.
We did things that, in part, were designed to avoid mistakes that had been made back in the 60s when the Vietnam War was conducted.
George Herbert Walker Bush would do more than just draw a line in the sand of the Persian Gulf. He would help lay to rest the demons of America's past.
We had not projected power since Vietnam. We had not really taken significant action of this nature since Vietnam. It's amazing to me how quickly we have forgotten how that, to a great extent, had been tying the hands of presidents in the United States for a long, long time.
Vietnam, that war cleaves us still.
More than 58,000 lives lost in a decade of war, fought not to win, but rather to break the enemy's will.
This is a fact. The final lesson of Vietnam is that no great nation can long afford to be sundered by a memory.
The 41st President of the United States came into office with America's lone defeat still fresh in the collective memory of the country. Vietnam was the Cold War conflict, the chess match between the superpowers.
There was a sort of a set piece. I mean, we knew who the good guys were, we knew who the bad guys were.
But in the first year of the Bush presidency, everything changes. Revolution is in the air.
Tiananmen Square, fall of the wall.
The Cold War was clearly beginning to wind down.
By the fall, the Soviet Empire has begun to crumble. The superpower chess match comes to a sudden end.
The Cold War was sort of as if we had been fighting with this dragon for 45 years. We finally killed him, but then we found ourselves where we are now in a jungle full of a large number of poisonous snakes, and snakes are a lot harder to keep track of than the dragon was.
One such snake would make his presence known in the sands of the Persian Gulf. Saddam Hussein, President of Iraq. The desert dictator sends 5,000 tanks and 500,000 soldiers into the tiny nation of Kuwait, his neighbor to the south. The invasion catches the White House off guard.
When I actually first told him, he was in the health unit getting a back rub, and so he just had a towel around him.
Saddam Hussein had practically been on the payroll, receiving more than $5 billion in U.S. loans during the 80s, the last billion approved by President Bush.
About 6 months before he attacked Kuwait, he changed dramatically from sort of getting along with us and so on to being belligerently opposed.
The issue is oil and land. Hussein had accused Kuwait of stealing billions of dollars in black gold from the Rumaila oil field near the Iraq-Kuwaiti border. He began massing troops there in late July.
24 hours before the invasion, my representative was telling the others that in our view, he would attack within 12 to 24 hours. The information coming from the Arab states themselves, directly to the President and to the Secretary of State, were almost consistently that Saddam Hussein would not attack another Arab state. People in the Middle East didn't believe it.
Secretary of State James Baker, meeting with Soviet Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze in Turkey, even goes as far as asking his Cold War foe to double-check the CIA findings.
He said, "Oh, I can't believe he would be that foolish. He's not going to do that." And I said, "Well, you better check it, because our reports are that they're amassing substantial troops on the border." And so he said, "I will." He went to the KGB. They came back and said there's nothing to it. He's not going to invade Kuwait.
July 25th. April Glaspie, the U.S. ambassador to Baghdad, personally tells Hussein the U.S. does not take a stand on territorial disputes. It is standard State Department policy. And yet, 8 days later, Saddam makes his move.
By taking Kuwait, Saddam Hussein had added about 100 billion barrels of reserves to what he already had in Iraq.
Saddam Hussein did not stop at Kuwait City, but marshaled some 190,000 troops on the Saudi border.
He could have gone on down into Saudi Arabia and gained control of the largest known reserves of petroleum in the world.
The Commander-in-Chief orders an early morning meeting of his National Security Council.
The tone of the meeting was, well, you know, that's halfway around the world.
Some call it a filling station in the desert. It took a while for some of the people in the administration to focus on Kuwait as a national security interest.
For the Commander-in-Chief, the right course of action is never in doubt. Within 24 hours, he orders a battle group of U.S. ships loaded with fighter planes and bombers to the Persian Gulf. At the administration's urging, the United Nations Security Council passes Resolution 660, condemning the invasion and demanding an unconditional withdrawal by Baghdad. The wheels are in motion for a war. And for the first time in half a century, the superpowers are on the same side.
Today, we take the unusual step of jointly calling upon the rest of the international community to join with us in an international cutoff of all arms supplies to Iraq.
That's the day the Cold War ended for me, because it was unheard of that the American Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union would be standing shoulder to shoulder condemning the action of a Soviet client state.
The Commander-in-Chief has the support of his lifelong enemy. Now he puts Saddam Hussein and the rest of the world on notice.
This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait.
Very, very risky.
was Colin Powell, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who saw that on television and went, whoa, my God, the president has just bet the whole ranch and to a certain extent his presidency on this very early on.
He took the position from the very beginning that he was going to do whatever was required to reverse this. And he was, frankly, I think, out in front of all of his advisors. The commander-in-chief was being the commander-in-chief.
The gauntlet has been thrown down, the challenge taken. Now the commander-in-chief would see if this new world order would be up to the task. The Iraqi army, 500,000 strong, occupies Kuwait. Saddam Hussein sends tens of thousands of troops to the Saudi Arabian border. More than half the world's oil reserves are within his grasp. The U.S. carrier battle group Independence is en route from the Indian Ocean.
If we had not moved quickly, it's my view, both then and now, that he would have gone in. Why is a mystery, because in that part of the world, people get out their checkbooks and they stop these things.
President Bush, backed by the United Nations and his Cold War foe, the Soviet Union, moves to rally the Persian Gulf against one of its own.
It has been the most hectic 48 hours since I've been president. The enormity of Iraq is upon me now. I've been on the phone incessantly. George Bush, journal entry, August 5th.
This was the networking amongst heads of state. George Bush reached out and touched them on a constant basis.
He had spent his entire life in public service preparing for this very moment.
Vice President, representative at the UN, representative in Beijing, director of Central Intelligence. There was no on-the-job training for George Bush.
He had a confidence that he understood what had to be done.
He didn't dodge decisions. He didn't ruminate. He thought it through, and then he made the decisions. And that's about the way presidents should be, don't you think so?
In my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia.
From that moment on, there was really never any doubt in my mind that the president would do whatever was necessary, including, if he had to, use force to liberate Kuwait and restore the rightful government.
The 82nd Airborne Division lands. As F-15s from the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing begin patrolling the Gulf. The 24th Mechanized Division, tanks and heavy weapons, ships out within a week. But Operation Desert Shield is more for show than a viable defense against Saddam.
It's not well known that when we landed what we landed initially in Saudi Arabia, the tanks were really inferior to what the Soviets had previously supplied to Iraq.
Heavy divisions, the kind that we ultimately ended up sending to Saudi Arabia, it's a matter of weeks or even months to get them there with all of their equipment and logistic support and so forth.
And this is a moment when Saddam could have moved and had the upper hand.
The Desert Mirage is sustained with help from other Arab states. Egypt, Morocco, and Syria send troops to join the U.S. force in Saudi Arabia. The commander-in-chief is building an Arab alliance against Hussein. Now the politician must explain to the nation why he's sending Americans into danger.
But if history teaches us anything, it is that we must resist aggression or it will destroy our freedoms.
When the crisis started, he was reading a very large book on the origins of World War II. And he was just at the part where the Germans were invading Poland in 1939.
As was the case in the 1930s, we see in Saddam Hussein an aggressive dictator threatening his neighbors.
He said, it's just like the Nazis.
We're dealing with Hitler revisited, a totalitarianism and a brutality that is naked and unprecedented in modern times.
For George Bush, it is a simple case of good versus evil, and evil has a name and a face. The president would demonize his enemy to make his case with the people. It's a tactic the commander-in-chief has used before, with results.
He has no real following. He's a thug, crook, witchcraft drug dealer, everything evil. And his time is up. George Bush, journal entry, December 24th, 1989.
The commander-in-chief deploys a division of Marines and Army Rangers into Panama City. The objective? Neutralize a rogue defense force and capture public enemy number one, General Manuel Noriega. His forces had killed a Marine at a roadblock 3 days before.
We were in Panama under treaty. We had thousands of troops stationed there. We'd been there for nearly 100 years. If all of a sudden our people are being shot in the streets, that's obviously unacceptable.
The police force is put down in a matter of hours. Tens of thousands of weapons confiscated. But Noriega is nowhere to be found. He had been a U.S. narcotics informant since the Nixon administration and had even been given a tour of CIA headquarters by then-director George Bush.
Old associates should not get a pass to act like brutes and aggressors and thieves and thugs.
Noriega had seized power in the early 80s and had antagonized his old employers ever since. 4 months into Bush's watch, Panama holds general elections. Noriega has his opposition candidates beaten in the streets. The president publicly urges his overthrow.
Well, in October, there was an attempt against Noriega. Turned out it was badly handled.
Literally limited hours beforehand, the White House had some sense that something was going on.
But the administration was, admittedly, slow to react.
Noriega was able to talk his way out, get the guy to give up his weapons.
Noriega then turned on him and executed him. It was a strange kind of a coup.
Had Washington intervened in October, it might have prevented Operation Just Cause.
I think President Bush felt, and I know I felt, that we missed an opportunity, that we might have encouraged the perpetrators of that coup and then not been there for them when the time came because of the reluctance of some in the administration to go into Panama at that time.
7 months later, 24 Americans would give their lives to take down Noriega's regime. Noriega eventually surrenders, is extradited, tried, and convicted of drug trafficking. He's now serving 120 years in a Florida prison.
The president drew a line, Noriega crossed it, and the president took the necessary action. It's not very complicated.
August 1990. The commander-in-chief draws a line in the sand of the Persian Gulf. But this mission is much more complicated. Noriega was a third-world bully in his own backyard. Saddam Hussein has an army of 500,000 men outfitted with U.S. and Soviet armament. The Persian Gulf is his territory. Even new allies have reservations.
We must resist aggression, or it will destroy our freedoms.
Now that you've seen Commander-in-Chief George H. Bush, Part 1, talk about this. Explain the process of demonizing an enemy during wartime. What purpose does it serve? Consider Bush's demonization of Saddam Hussein. Was he successful in using this tactic? If so, how? Now try this. Using the resource of your school or public library, create a collage of headlines and images from newspapers and magazines relating to Panama and the Persian Gulf. Focus on the power of the Commander-in-Chief. Log on to discoveryschool.com for curriculum materials and resources to support Commander-in-Chief George H. Bush. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests The U.S. Presidency by Don Nardo. Consider this before viewing Commander-in-Chief George H. Bush, Part 2. Discuss the factors a president must consider before sending troops into battle. As you watch the program, think about the economic and political interests the United States had in the Persian Gulf. Also, note why President Bush decided in favor of armed conflict despite many risks. Assignment Discovery now presents Commander-in-Chief George H. Bush, Part 2.
We must resist aggression, or it will destroy our freedoms.
Outnumbered 10 to 1 in enemy territory, the Commander-in-Chief faces the awesome decision of ordering a military solution. Two weeks since the Iraqi invasion, and 50,000 U.S. troops are digging in along the Saudi border. Saddam Hussein counters, declaring all foreigners inside his territory will be detained and placed around military installations as human shields.
That just absolutely infuriated the president.
Blatant hostage holding. I cannot tolerate, nor will I, another Tehran. I am determined in that. It may cost American lives, but we cannot sacrifice American principle or American leadership. George Bush, journal entry, August 17.
The Commander-in-Chief knows Saddam Hussein has committed unspeakable acts. His scientists had stockpiled chemical weapons. They are working on an atomic bomb.
These weapons of mass destruction had a real appeal to Saddam Hussein, or just the idea that he could create the impression that he had them.
U.S. troops are outfitted with gas masks, protective bodysuits, boots, and gloves. By October, more than 200,000 are in the line of fire, outnumbered 2 to 1 by Saddam's army. The Commander-in-Chief turns to his military for options.
This was a plan by people who really didn't want to do it.
The reason for that was because, in the judgment of the commander in the field, he didn't have enough troops to do anything else.
The President orders his top soldier, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, to Saudi Arabia. He wants Powell and Schwarzkopf to spell out exactly what they need to win a war.
Not send enough force so you're almost sure of winning, but send enough force to make sure it will happen, that there is no doubt. Well, war is full of doubt.
The Ghosts of Vietnam. Now, names on a wall. The commander-in-chief would have to face down the demons of America's past in order to prevail in the Persian Gulf. The Vietnam Syndrome, committing power and prestige to an intractable conflict. Like walking into quicksand, slowly sinking, with no means of escape.
I said, I know you know this, George. I said, but this situation has all the elements that have brought down other presidencies. Body bags, $40 oil, and all of these other potential adverse developments. And his answer to me was, I know that, Jimmy. I know that very well, but we're going to do what's right.
The first order, fight this war to win and win big. The commander-in-chief had asked his top military brass what they would need to crush the opposition.
They came back, said, well, we want another Marine division. We want the 7th Corps out of Germany. We want the Big Red One out of Fort Riley, Kansas. We want 6 aircraft carrier battle groups.
I have today directed the Secretary of Defense to increase the size of U.S. forces committed to Desert Shield to ensure that the coalition has an adequate offensive military option should that be necessary to achieve our common goals.
In a matter of weeks, the United States would have more troops on the ground in the Persian Gulf than it had ever had in Vietnam. The commander-in-chief is no longer playing defense. He's digging in for war.
And we have an opportunity to stay the course with sanctions.
George, the Congress decides whether to make war. So the bullets start flying. 90% of the casualties.
Talk not truth. Talk not truth. Talk not truth. Talk not truth.
We underestimated the reaction.
There were those experts, so-called experts, who were going up to Congress, testifying on Capitol Hill, claiming there are going to be 10,000 Americans come home in body bags and so forth.
We stand on the brink of catastrophe.
It is not their sons and daughters who will do the dying.
How many body bags is it worth, Mr. Secretary, to do this, to eject Iraq from Kuwait and all that kind of stuff?
On Capitol Hill, Congress launches televised hearings on whether sanctions would eventually force Saddam out of Kuwait. But with the doubling of the American forces in the Gulf, the die had been cast.
President Bush kind of led us to the point where we were either going to have to respond very aggressively militarily, or we'd have to pull back. And at that point, you really couldn't pull back.
Sanctions take time. Maintaining a fighting force 500,000 strong takes billions of dollars by the month. They could not stay there forever.
In a sense, you made yourself susceptible to blackmail by Saddam Hussein.
If he had said, I will leave, and I will leave unconditionally, and made a public statement to that effect, and then just delayed his departure and drug it out, we would have been hard put to go do what needed to be done.
The kids look so young, and yet they're gung-ho. I am convinced more than ever that we can knock Saddam Hussein out early. I'm worried that the American people might think this will be another Vietnam. But it isn't, and it won't be. George Bush, journal entry, November 22nd.
The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 678.
November 29th. The UN Security Council passes Resolution 678, demanding Iraq withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, 1991, or else. The clock is ticking. The commander-in-chief has set a course for war, but employing overwhelming force is a gamble. He's left his enemy with a means to escape. Christmas in the desert. The American commitment in the Gulf will soon be bigger than it ever was in Vietnam. The Commander-in-Chief spends Christmas Eve reading letters from the families of those he has placed in harm's way.
Take care of my kid. Please, don't shoot. It's not worth dying for gasoline. And on it goes. But the cry is, save my boy. Save my boy. And I sit here knowing that if there is no movement on Saddam's part, we have to go to war. George Bush, journal entry, December 24th.
On the one hand, he's hoping that the cup of combat, he won't have to drink from it. On the other hand, he knows that that is the best way out at this point.
6 days before the UN deadline for Iraqi withdrawal, Secretary of State Baker meets with Baghdad's Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz in Geneva. The Commander-in-Chief takes one last stab at a diplomatic solution.
That was probably the longest day of his life, just waiting.
Bush was fearful that the diplomatic card might work. And if it had worked and there had been this delay and Saddam had kind of strung things out, the pressure on the United States would have been immense. And he could have, Saddam conceivably could have won that way.
Baker and Aziz meet for 7 hours, staring each other down and saying very little.
One last effort, he took a letter to deliver to Aziz to take to Saddam Hussein. Tariq Aziz wouldn't even accept the letter.
He stiffed us completely and entirely, basically said, to hell with you. What will be, will be.
There is no way to describe the pressure. It's 9:45, the night of the 15th. The reports from Baghdad are defiant. Their faces smile and they chant. And I think, oh God, save their lives. George Bush, journal entry, January 15th.
He had been sent into war himself nearly 40 years before. A bomber pilot shot down in the South Pacific. 2 of his crew lost at sea. Memories of war lead the combat-seasoned veteran to his Air Force Chief of Staff for reassurance about the hours and days ahead.
And I sort of sat back and watched these 2 fighter pilots talk about the air war. And General McPeak was able to lay out for the president, we'd already briefed him formally on what the plans were and so forth, but to give him that sense of confidence that the pilots were ready, that the troops were prepared,
Hey, Sir Bales?
that the equipment would work. The munitions would hit the targets. That in fact, everything was going to be okay. Your sense of it is not that you're in control. Because by that point, you've turned over the fate of the nation in a sense to the commander in the field. He's passed it on down the chain of command. So it's that young lieutenant flying the F-15 that's got to hit his target, execute his mission perfectly, or otherwise you're in big trouble.
January 17th, the Commander-in-Chief unleashes a desert storm.
Launch.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait.
It will become known as hyperwar.
You could see from the screens, on the TV screen, the bombs starting to fall in Baghdad. Talk about watching a war unfold in real time. It was an uncanny feeling.
The most technologically advanced warfare ever plays out like a lethal computer game on television screens all over the world. Like the German Blitzkrieg, hyperwar is meant to overwhelm the enemy with non-stop, lightning-quick attacks. Precision-guided munitions, smart bombs, delivered by F-117 stealth bombers, are designed to provide pinpoint accuracy. The objective? Decapitate the enemy by going after his command and communications. Navy Tomahawk cruise missiles and Army Apache helicopters concentrate on Iraqi air defense system and supply lines. The first 24 hours set the tone for a one-sided war. The coalition flies 2,000 sorties, dropping 2,500 tons of munitions, losing 8 aircraft, but only 1 American killed.
Oh, yes!
I get tired of hearing the whining reporters saying that they're not getting enough information. Press, God bless them, are a menace that we can't live with, and we can't live without. George Bush, journal entry, January 21st.
The president understood, having been in one major war himself, that war is not clean, it's not simple, and there will be mistakes made. He just wanted us to do our very best not to let that happen.
They just moved out on a line to assault.
Reporters in Vietnam had roamed the war zones on their own. In the Persian Gulf, this would not be allowed.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq.
The daily briefing defines the coverage given to the nation.
Right through the crosshairs. And now in his rearview mirror.
Although the hit ratio is questioned by some, the Allied air campaign is clearly crippling Saddam's war machine. The Allies own the skies. But Saddam has a deadly response. A strike against the Arab world's sworn enemy, a last-gasp attempt to turn the international coalition into an Arab-Israeli free-for-all, a World War III. The commander-in-chief sends batteries of U.S. Patriot missiles with his Undersecretary of State and vows an Allied response.
We set up a special cell of experts over there to cooperate, share intelligence, and let them know we were doing everything we could to defeat the Iraqi threat.
That threat is diminishing with every hour. By day 2 of the hyperwar, the Allies are targeting chemical and nuclear test sites and civilian infrastructure, electrical plants and bridges. Sensing defeat, Saddam changes tactics. He turns his war machine loose on the world.
The whole Gulf region on fire with the oil wells and the pillaging by Saddam Hussein. It was one of the most blatant acts by any head of government, this time the Iraqi government, since World War II.
More than 600 oil wells are set ablaze. Nearly 500 million gallons of oil spilled into the Persian Gulf. If he couldn't have it, no one would. 38 days, 110,000 sorties flown. Nearly 90,000 tons of bombs dropped.
They're just, we're going to back away from them a little bit.
Our gun is out of ammo at this time. Everything seems to be normal.
The Commander-in-Chief's hyperwar has destroyed the enemy's ability to fight and his will to win.
Basically, as we pull up to the positions, they see the armor, the heavy tanks are rolling up. They just surrender so far.
We had TV pictures running of 80,000 Iraqis who had surrendered. Our troops had gone from being warriors to all of a sudden being angels of mercy.
It would take the Allies less than 100 hours to reclaim Kuwait. But in the twilight of Saddam's defeat, America suffered its greatest single loss of life. An Iraqi Scud missile strikes a U.S. barracks in Darain, killing 28 Americans and wounding 100 more. The cost of war, even one that has turned into a slaughter.
I would say that perhaps the most difficult decision was knowing when to stop the war.
Just as proof of Iraqi atrocities had moved the Commander-in-Chief to act 6 months earlier, pictures of the carnage he ordered would help determine the end.
The tanks and trucks and bodies were strewn across this highway. That affected him. Isn't this enough? Haven't we done enough?
The Allies had achieved their objectives in 43 days of war. And yet, Saddam Hussein remains in power.
While he, I'm sure, would like to see Saddam happily ensconced someplace else in this world or another, we had accomplished what we set out to do. Can you imagine what it would have been like looking for Saddam Hussein in Baghdad if we had gone there? We probably would have gotten into a house-to-house and other situations trying to find him.
The Iraqi leader would continue to defy the international community for years to come. George Bush would be criticized for allowing a man he called Hitler Revisited to remain in power.
As president, I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
Overzealous rhetoric may have been the only mistake made by George Bush in the Persian Gulf. The decisive victory helped lay to rest the ghost of Vietnam.
When everybody came home again, we had this tremendous outpouring of patriotic fervor, if you will, in the United States. People felt really good about what we'd done, and the troops did especially. It was a great sense of happiness and satisfaction and success at what we had accomplished as a nation.
There's a new and wonderful feeling in America. Later today.
This was a classic case, both politically, diplomatically, militarily, of the way to handle these kinds of situations. It really was.
This was his moment. You have to give him a lot of credit.
The final lesson of George Herbert Walker Bush may be that victory on the battlefield, no matter how decisive, cannot guarantee victory at the ballot box, and the mistakes of the past cannot be overcome by turning away from the problems of the present. He would be voted out of office 20 months after presiding over the most clear-cut military victory in American history.
I'm sitting here alone now. The desk is clear and the pictures are gone. As I told Bill Clinton, I feel the same sense of wonder and majesty about this office today as I did when I first walked in here. It's my last day as President of the United States of America. George Bush, journal entry, January 20th, 1993.
Keep watching. Discussion topics and activity and resources for Commander-in-Chief George H. Bush are up next on Assignment Discovery. Now that you've seen Commander-in-Chief George H. Bush, Part 2, talk about this. Discuss the role of the news media during wartime. How much access should reporters have to the soldiers and to the battlefield? How did media coverage in Vietnam and the Persian Gulf differ? In what ways did these differences influence public perception of each war? Now, try this. Using the internet and your local library, research the aftermath of the Persian Gulf War. Create a timeline highlighting events of American interest in the years following the war. Log on to discoveryschool.com for curriculum materials and resources to support Commander-in-Chief George H. Bush. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests Persian Gulf War by Kathleen and Martin Gay.
The preceding program is part of Cable in the Classroom, a free service of the cable communications industry and your local cable company.